weeks, hopefully. Um, so now I gotta find time to do my videos. Um, so I gotta figure out like when the best time to do my videos are. I'm gonna be not just working like damn near three jobs already. So I'm doing a warehouse job, an airport job, and my comedy career on top of my YouTube videos. Um, so yeah. So today we're gonna talk about the Donner Party. Now the Donner Party, sometimes called the Donner Reed Party, was a group of American pioneers who had immigrated to California in a wagon train from the Midwest. They were delayed by a multitude of mishaps, and they spent the winter of 1846 and 1847 snowbound in the Sierra Nevada. Um, some of the migrants resorted to cannibalism to survive, mainly eating the bodies of those who had succumbed um, to starvation, sickness, or extreme cold. But in one case, they murdered and ate two Indian guides. Now, the Donner Party originated from Springfield, Illinois, and they departed Independence, Missouri, on the Oregon Trail in the spring of 1846. Now, the journey west usually took between 4 and 6 months, but the Donner Party was slowed after electing to follow a new route called the Hastings Cutoff, which bypassed established trails and instead it crossed the Rocky Mountains, Wasatch Range, and the Great Salt Lake Desert in present-day Utah. The desolate and rugged terrain and the difficulties that they later encountered while traveling along the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada resulted in the loss of many cattle and wagons, and divisions soon formed within the group. Now, by early November of 1846, the migrants had reached the Sierra Nevada, but they became trapped by an early heavy snowfall near Truckee Lake, which is now Donner Lake, high in the mountains. Their food supplies ran dangerously low, and in mid-December, some of the group set out on foot to obtain help. Rescuers from California attempted to reach the migrants, but the first relief party did not arrive until the middle of February of 1847, almost 4 months after the wagon train became trapped. Of the 87 members of the party, only 48 members survived. Historians have described the episode as one of the most fascinating tragedies in California history and in the record of American westward migration. Now, during the 1840s, there was a dramatic increase in settlers leaving the East to resettle in the Oregon Territory of California, which at this time it was only accessible by only by a very long sea voyage or a daunting overland journey. Now, some such as Patrick Breen saw California, then a part of Mexico, as a place where they would be free to live in a fully Catholic culture. Others were attracted to the West's burgeoning economic opportunities, or they were inspired by manifest destiny. Now, the belief that the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans belonged to European Americans and that they should settle it. Most wagon trains followed the Oregon Trail. Hello? Um, so most wagon trains followed the Oregon Trail from a starting point, basically, in Independence, Missouri to the Continental Divide, traveling about 15 miles a day on a journey that usually took between 4 and 6 months. Now, the trail generally followed rivers to South Pass, a mountain pass in present-day Wyoming, which was relatively easy for wagons to negotiate and to net and stuff like that. And from there, yes, I am. I'm a big history buff. Now, from there, pioneers had a choice of routes to their destination. Now, here's a picture of an encampment of the tents and stuff like that from the Donner Party. So this is an encampment of tents covered wagons on the Humboldt River in Nevada in 1859. Lansford Hastings, an early migrant from Ohio to the West, published the Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California to encourage the settlers. As an alternative to the Oregon Trail's standard route through Idaho's Snake River Plain, he proposed a more direct route, which actually increased the trip's mileage by 125 miles to California across the Great Basin, which would take travelers throughout the Wasatch Range and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had not traveled any part of his proposed shortcut until early 1846 on a trip from California to Fort Bridger, a scant supply station run by Jim Bridger at Black's Fork, Wyoming. Hastings stayed at the fort to persuade travelers to turn south on his route, but as of 1846, Hastings was the second person documented to have crossed the southern part of the Great Salt Lake Desert, but neither had been accompanied by any wagons. Now, arguably, the most difficult part of the journey to California was the last 100 miles across the Sierra Nevada. The mountain range has 500 distinct peaks over 12,000 feet high, and because of its height and proximity to the Pacific Ocean, the range receives more snow than most other ranges in North America. The eastern side of the range, the Sierra Escarpment, is notoriously steep. After a wagon train left Missouri for Oregon to California, timing was crucial to ensure that it would not be bogged down by mud created by spring rains or by any massive snow drifts in the mountains from September onward, and that horses and oxen had enough spring grass to eat for the time being. Now, in the spring of 1846, almost 500 wagons headed west from Independence, Missouri. At the rear of the train, a group of 9 wagons containing 32 members of the Reed and Donner families and their employees left on May 12th. George Donner was about 60 years old and living near Springfield, Illinois. With him were his 44-year-old wife, Tamsen, their 3 daughters, Frances, who was 6, Georgia, who was 4, and Eliza, who was 3, and George's daughters from a previous marriage, Alethea, 14, Leanna, 12, and George's younger brother, Jacob, 56, would join the party with his wife, Elizabeth, who was 45, and then their stepson, Solomon Hook, 14, and William Hook, 12, and 5 children, George, who was 9, Mary, who was 7, Isaac, who was 6, Louis, who was 4, and Samuel, who was 1. Now, also traveling with the Donner brothers were Teamsters Hiram O. Miller, 29, Samuel Shoemaker, 25, Noah James, who was 16, Charles Berger, who was 30, John Denton, who was 28, and Augusta Spitzer, who was 30. Now, James F. Reed, who was 45, was accompanied on the journey by his wife, Margaret, 32, stepdaughter Virginia, 13, and daughter Martha Jane, who was known as Patty, age 8, and their sons Thomas and James, who were 5 and 3, and their daughter and Sarah Keyes, Margaret's mother. Keyes was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis and died at a campsite that they named Alcove Springs. Here's a picture of James and Margaret Reed right here. So this picture here is James and Margaret Reed. You can see that there. Down here is George Donner, who was the Donner Reed party. Like, that's what they called it, that. Now, Margaret's mother, Sarah Keyes, was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis, and she died at a campsite that they named Alcove Springs. So she was buried nearby, off to the side of the trail, with a gray rock inscribed, Miss Sarah Keyes died on May 29th, 1846, at the age of 70. In addition to leaving financial worries behind, Reed had hoped that California's climate would help Margaret, who had long suffered from ill health. Now the Reeds hired 3 men to drive the ox teams: Milford, Elliott, and James Smith, and Walter Heron, 25. Bayless Williams, 24, went along as a handyman, and his sister Eliza, 25, as the family's cook. Now, within a week of leaving Independence, the Reeds and Donners joined a group of 50 wagons, nominally that was led by William Russell, and by June 16th, the company had traveled 450 miles, with 200 miles to go before Fort Laramie. They had been delayed by rain and a rising river, but Tamsen Donner wrote to a friend in Springfield, "Indeed, if I do not experience something far worse than I have yet done, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started." Young Virginia Reed recalled years later that during the first part of the trip, she was perfectly happy. Now, several other families had joined the wagon train along the way. Lavina Murphy, 37, a widow from Tennessee, headed a family of 13. Now, her five youngest children were John Landrum, 16, Miriam, known as Mary, 14, Lemuel, 12, William, 10, and Simon, 8. Lavina's 2 married daughters and their families also came along. Sarah Murphy Foster, who was 19, and her husband William H., 30, and son Jeremiah, who was only 1. Harriet Murphy Pike, who was 18, her husband William M., 32, and their daughters Naomi, 3, and Catherine, 1. William H. Eady, 28, a carriage maker from Illinois, brought his wife Eleanor, 25, and their 2 sons, James, 3, and Margaret, 1. Now, Now, the Breen family consisted of Patrick Breen, 51, Patrick Breen, 51, a farmer from Ohio. Sorry, Iowa. His wife Margaret, who's known as Peggy, 40, and 7 children: John, 14, Edward, 13, Patrick Jr., 9, Simon, 8, James, 5, Peter, 3, and their 11-month-old daughter Isabel. Now, their neighbor, 40-year-old bachelor Patrick Dolan, traveled with them, and German immigrant Louis Kesselberg, 32, joined along with his wife Elizabeth Philippine, 22, and their daughter Ada, who was 2. Son Louis Jr. was born on the trail, and 2 young single men named Spitzer and Reinhardt traveled with another German couple, the Wolfingers, who were rumored to be wealthy, but they also hired a driver, Dutch Charlie Berger. An older man named Hardcoop rode with them. Now, Luke Halloran, a young man with tuberculosis, could no longer ride horseback, but the families he had been traveling with no longer had resources to care for him. He was taken by George Donner at Little Sandy River and rode in their wagon. Now, to promote his new route, the Hastings call-off, Lansford Hastings sent writers to deliver letters to traveling migrants. On July 12th, the Reeds and Donners were given one. Hastings warned the migrants that they could expect opposition from the Mexican authorities in California, and he advised them to band together in large groups. He also claimed to have worked out a new and better road to California and said he would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide the migrants along the new cutoff. Now, on July 20th, at the Little Sandy River, most of the wagon train opted to follow the established trail via the Fort Hull. A smaller group opted to head for Fort Bridger, and they needed a leader. James Reed had military experience, but his autocratic attitude had rubbed many in the party the wrong way, and they saw him as an aristocratic, imperious, and ostentatious. Now, by comparison, the mature, experienced Donner's peaceful and charitable nature made him the group's first choice, while the members of the party were comfortably well off by contemporary standards, and most of them were inexperienced in long, difficult, and overland travel. Now, additionally, the members of the party had little knowledge about how to interact with any Native Americans. And this is a map of the route that was taken by the Donner-Reed party, showing the Hastings cutoff right here. So in the middle here, you see Hastings cutoff. And this is technically what they're supposed to have gone down. And here's the Oregon Trail. So this is like a map of the whole route that they took. Let's go down here. Okay, so so journalist Edwin Bryant reached Black's Fork a week ahead of the Donner Party. He saw the first part of the trail, and he was concerned that it would be difficult for the wagons in the Donner group, especially with so many women and children. He returned to Black's Fork to leave letters warning several members of the group not to take the Hastings shortcut. But by the time the Donner Party reached Black's Fork on July 27th, Hastings had already left, leading the 40 wagons of the Harlan Young group. Because Jim Bridger's trading post would fare substantially better if people used the Hastings cutoff, Bridger had told the party that the shortcut was a smooth trip, and it was devoid of rugged country and hostile Native Americans, and it would shorten their journey by 350 miles. Now, water would be easy to find along the way, although a couple of days cross a 30-40 mile dry lake bed would be necessary. Now, Reed was very impressed by this information and advocated for the Hastings cutoff. None of the party ever received Bryant's letters, but in his diary account, Bryant states his conviction that Bridger deliberately concealed the letters, a view that was shared by Reed in his later testimony. At Fort Laramie, Reed met an old friend named James Kleiman, who was coming from California. Kleiman warned Reed not to take the Hastings cutoff, telling him that wagons would not be able to make it, and that Hastings information was inaccurate and not reliable. Fellow pioneer Jesse Quinn Thornton traveled part of the way with Donner and Reed, and in his book From Oregon and California, 1848, he declared Hastings the Baron Munchausen of travelers in these countries. Tamsen Donner, according to Thornton, was gloomy, sad, and dispirited at the thought of turning off the main trail on the advice of Hastings, whom she considered a selfish adventurer. On July 31st of 1846, the Donner Party left Black's Fork after 4 days of rest and wagon repairs, 11 days behind the leading Harlan Young group. Now Donner hired a replacement driver, and the company was joined by the McCutcheon family, consisting of William, who was 30, and his wife Amanda, 24, and their 2-year-old daughter Harriet, and a 16-year-old named Jean-Baptiste Trudeau from New Mexico, who claimed to have knowledge of the Native Americans and terrain on the way to California. Now, with Wasatch Ranch, the party turned south to follow the Hastings cutoff. Within days, they found the terrain to be much more difficult than described. Drivers were forced to lock the wheels of their wagons to prevent them from rolling down any steep incline. Years of traffic on the main Oregon Trail had left an easy and an obvious path, whereas the cutoff was more difficult to find. Hastings wrote directions and left letters stuck to trees. On August 6th, the party found a letter from him advising them to stop until he could show them an alternate route that could be taken by the Harlan Young Party. Reed and Charles T. Stanton and William Pike rode ahead to get Hastings, and they encountered exceedingly difficult canyons where boulders had to be moved and walls cut off precariously to a river below, a route likely to break wagons. In his letter, Hastings had offered to guide the Donner Party around the more difficult areas, but he rode back only partway, indicating the general direction that needed to be followed. Here up here you can see pictures of what the cutoff part was. This is Immigration Canyon, a route of the Hastings cutoff. And then to the right here is Donner Hill at the mouth of the Immigration Canyon, the last obstacle in the Wasatch Range. Now you could see here how difficult it would be for a wagon to get around this. There was no way in hell that a wagon could handle this type of terrain if you were riding one back then. Now Stanton and Pike had stopped to rest, and Reed returned alone to the group, arriving 4 days after the party's departure. Without the guide that they had been promised, the group had to decide whether to turn back and rejoin the traditional trail or follow the tracks left by the Harlan Young Party through the difficult terrain of Weber Canyon, or they had to forge their own trail in the direction that Hastings had recommended. At Reed's urging, the group chose the new Hastings route. Their progress slowed to about 1.5 miles a day. All able-bodied men were required to clear brush, chop trees, and heave rocks to make room for the wagons to get through. And here's a picture of Charles T. Stanton, also known as Charles Tyler Stanton. That's a sideways picture, but still you can see somewhat of his face. As the Donner Party made its way across the Wasatch range of the Rocky Mountains, the Graves family, who had set off to find them, reached them. They consisted of Franklin Ward Graves, 57, his wife Elizabeth, 45, their children Mary, 20, William, 18, Eleanor, 15, Lavina, 13, Nancy, 9, Jonathan, 7, Franklin Jr., 5, and Elizabeth, 1-year-old, and their married daughter Sarah, 22, plus their son-in-law Jay Fosdick, 23, and 25-year-old teamster named John Snyder, traveling together in 3 different wagons. Their arrival brought the Donner Party to 87 members in 60 to 80 different wagons. The Graves family had been part of the last group to leave Missouri, confirming the Donner Party was the back of the year's Western Exodus. It was August 20th by the time that they had reached a point in the mountains where they could see the Great Salt Lake, and it took almost another 2 weeks to travel out of the Wasatch Range. The men began arguing, and doubts were expressed about the wisdom of those who had chosen this route, in particular Reed. Now food and supplies began to run out for some time of the less affluent families. Now Stanton and Pike had ridden out with Reed, but had become lost on their way back by the time the party found them. They were a day away from eating their horses. Disturbing. Now, here's a picture of the here's a picture of the Great Salt Lake desert. That's like a lake, basically. Luke Halloran died of tuberculosis on August 25th. A few days later, the party came across a tattered letter from Hastings. The pieces indicated that there were 2 days and nights of difficult travel ahead without grass or water. The party rested their oxen and prepared for the trip. After 36 hours, they set out to traverse a 1,000-foot mountain in their path. And from its peak, they saw had a dry, barren plain, perfectly flat and covered with white salt, larger than the one they had just crossed. In one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, according to Rurik. Their oxen were already fatigued, and their water was nearly gone. But the Donner Party continued to press onward on August 30th, having no alternative in the heat of the day. The moisture underneath the salt crust rose to the surface, and it turned into what we call what to refer to as into a gummy mass. Their wagon wheels sank into it, in some cases up to the hubs. The days were blisteringly hot and the nights frigid. And several of the group saw visions of lakes and wagon trains and believed that they had finally overtaken Hastings. After 3 days, the water was gone, and some of the party removed their oxen from the wagons to press ahead to find more. Some of the animals were so weakened that they were left yoked to the wagons and abandoned. 9 of Reed's 10 oxen broke free, crazed with thirst, and bolted off into the desert. Many other families, cattle, and horses went missing, and the journey irreparably damaged some of the wagons, but no human lives were lost at that point. Now, instead of the promised 2-day journey over 40 miles, the journey across 80 miles of the Great Salt Lake Desert took 6 days. Now, that's what happened back then. They didn't have cars back then, so they took wagons and they took horses and buggies to get around. They didn't have cars back then and this time. Now, none of the party had any remaining faith in the Hastings cutoff as they recovered at the springs on the other side of the desert. They spent several days trying to recover cattle, retrieve the wagons left in the desert, and transfer their food and supplies to other wagons. Reed's family incurred the heaviest losses, and Reed became more assertive, asking all the families to submit to an inventory of their goods and food to him. He suggested that 2 men go to Sutter's Fort in California, and he had heard that John Sutter was exceedingly generous to wayward pioneers, and he could assist them with extra provisions. Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon volunteered to undertake the dangerous trip, and the remaining serviceable wagons were pulled by mongrel teams of cows, oxen, and mules. It was the middle of September, and 2 young men who went in search of missing oxen reported that another 40 miles of desert lay ahead. Now, the cattle and oxen were now exhausted and lean, but the Donner Party crossed the next stretch of desert relatively unscapped. The journey seemed to get easier, at least so they seemed, but particularly through the valley next to the Ruby Mountains. Despite their near hatred of Hastings, they had no choice but to follow that track, which were weeks old. On September 26th, 2 months after embarking on the cutoff, the party rejoined the traditional trail along a stream that became known as the Humboldt River. The shortcut had probably delayed them by a whole month. Along the Humboldt River, the group met Native Americans who joined them for a couple of days, but stole or shot several oxen and horses. By now, it was getting well until October. And the Donner family split up to make better timing. 2 wagons and the remaining group became tangled, and John Snyder angrily beat the ox of Reed's hired teamster, Milt Elliott. When Reed intervened, Snyder rained blows onto his head with the whip handle. When Reed's wife attempted to intervene, she too was struck. Reed retaliated by fatally stabbing Snyder. Now, that evening, the witnesses gathered to discuss what was to be done. American laws were not applicable west of the Continental Divide in what was then Mexican territory because their laws were different. And wagon trains often dispensed their own justice, but George Donner, the party's leader, was a full day ahead of the main wagon train with his family. Snyder had been seen to hit Reed, and some claimed he also hit his wife, but Snyder had been popular and Reed was not. Kesselberg suggested that Reed should be hanged, but an eventual compromise allowed Reed to leave the camp without his family, who were to be taken care of by the others. Now, Reed departed alone the next morning, unarmed, but his stepdaughter Virginia rode ahead and secretly provided him with rifle and food for him to be able to survive. Now here's the Truckee River in wintertime, and this is the Truckee River picture. The trials that the Donner Party had so far endured resulted in splintered groups, each looking out for themselves and distrustful of other people. The grass was becoming scarce, and the animals were steadily weakening due to the fact that they didn't have enough food or water to survive. To relieve the animals' loads, everyone was expected to walk. Keseberg had ejected Hardcoop from his wagon, telling the elderly man that he had to walk or die. A few days later, Hardcoop sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen that they had split open, and he was never seen or heard from again. William Eddy pleaded with the others to find him, but they all refused, swearing that they were not going to waste any resources on a man who was dying at 70 years old. Now, meanwhile, Reed caught up with the Donners and proceeded with one of his teamsters, Walter Heron. The two shared a horse together, and they were able to cover 25 to 40 miles per day. The rest of the party rejoined the Donners, but the hardship continued. Native Americans chased away all of Graves' horses, and another wagon was left behind. With grass in short supply, the cattle spread out more, which allowed the Paiutes to steal 18 more during one evening. Several mornings later, they shot another 21. So far, the company had lost nearly 100 oxen and cattle, and that their rations were almost completely depleted. So with nearly all his cattle gone, Wolfinger stopped at the Humboldt Sink to bury his wagon. Reinhardt and Spitzer stayed behind to help, but they returned without him, reporting that they had been attacked by Paiutes and that he had been killed. One more stretch of desert lay ahead, and Eddy's oxen had been killed by Native Americans, and they were forced to abandon their wagon. The family had eaten all their stores, but the other families refused to assist their children. The Eddies were forced to walk carrying their children and miserable with thirst. And Margaret Reed and her children were also now without a wagon, but the desert soon came to an end, and the party found the Truckee River in a beautiful lush country. Oh, shit, hold on. Let me go back up here. So the company had little time for rest. They pressed on to cross the Sierra Nevada before the snow came. Stanton, one of the two men who had left a month earlier to seek assistance in California, found the company, and he brought mules and food from Sutter's Fort and two Native American guides employed by John Sutter. These Miwok men from the Cosumnes River area were known by their Catholic conversion names, Louis and Salvador. Stanton also brought news that Reed and Heron, although haggard and starving, had reached Sutter's Fort. By this point, according to Rarick, to the bedraggled, half-starved members of the Donner Party, it must have seemed that the worst of the problems had passed, even though it didn't. Now faced with one last push over mountains that were described as much worse than the Wasatch Range, the Donner Party had decided whether to forge ahead or rest their cattle. It was October 20th, and they had heard at Sutter's Fort that the pass now known as Donner Pass would not be snowed until the middle of November. Now, William Pike was killed when a gun being loaded by William Foster was discharged negligently. An event that seemed to make the decision for them. Family by family, they resumed their journey, first the Breens, then the Keseberg, Stanton with the Reeds, Graves, and the Murphys, and the Donners traveled last. After a few miles of rough terrain, an axle broke on one of the wagons. Jacob and George had went into the woods to fashion a replacement, but George Donner sliced his hand open while chiseling the wood, but it seemed to be a superficial wound. And here's a picture of the 7,088 foot high pass above the Truckee Lake, and it became blocked by early snow in November 1846. And this photographed in the 1870s. But both the pass and the lake are now named after the Donner Party. And like I said, you could see how a wagon would not be able to get through that. Now snow began to fall. The Breens made it up the massive, nearly vertical slope of 1,000 feet to the Truckee Lake, which is now known as Donner Lake. 3 miles from the pass summit, and camped near a cabin that had been built 2 years earlier by members of the Stevens Townsend Murphy party. The Eddies and the Kesselbergs joined the Breens, attempting to make it over the pass. They found 5 to 10 foot snow drifts and were unable to find the trail, but they turned back for Truckee Lake, and within a day, all the families were camped there except for the Donners, who were 5 miles, half a day's journey below them. Now, 60 members and associates of the Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Kesselberg, and Eddy families set up for the winter at Truckee Lake. 3 widely separated cabins of pine logs served as their homes, with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs that leaked when it rained. The Breens occupied one cabin, the Eddies and the Murphys another, and the Reeds and the Graves the third. Kesselberg built a lean-to for his family against the side of the Breen cabin. The families used canvas or oxide to patch the faulty roofs. The cabins had no windows or doors, only large holes to allow entry. Of the 60 at Truckee Lake, 19 were men over the age of 18, and 12 were women, and 29 of them were children, 6 of whom were toddlers or younger. Now, farther down the trail, close to Alder Creek, the Donner families hastily constructed tents to house 21 people, including Miss Wolfinger and the Donner's drivers, 6 men, 3 women, and 12 children in all. It began to snow again on the evening of November 4th, the beginning of an 8-day storm that did not let up. Now, by the time the party made camp, very little food remained from the supplies that Stanton had brought back from Sutter's Fort. The oxen would begin to die, and their carcasses were frozen and stacked. Now, Truckee Lake was not yet frozen, but the pioneers were unfamiliar with catching any trout. Eddy, the most experienced hunter, killed a bear, but had little luck after that. The Reed and Eddy families had lost almost everything. Margaret Reed promised to pay double when they got to California for the use of 3 oxen from the Graves and Breen families. Graves charged Eddy $25. Normally, the cost of 2 healthy oxen back then, that was pretty cheap money, for the carcass of an ox that had starved to death. Now, desperation grew in camp, and some reasons that individuals might succeed in navigating the pass where the wagons could not. In small groups, they made several attempts, but each time they returned defeated. Another severe storm lasting more than a week covered the area so deeply that the cattle and horses, their only remaining food, died and they were lost in the snow. Patrick Green began keeping a diary on November 20th. He concerned himself primarily with the weather, marking the storms and how much snow had fallen, but gradually it began to include religious references in his entries. People said that life at Truckee Lake was miserable to them. The cabins were cramped and filthy, and it snowed so fucking much that people were unable to go outdoors for days. Diet soon consisted of oxide, strips of which were boiled to make a disagreeable glue-like jelly. Ox and horse bones were boiled repeatedly to make soup, and they became so brittle that they would crumble upon chewing. Sometimes they were softened by being charred and eaten. Bit by bit, the Murphy children picked apart the oxhide rug that lay in front of their fireplace, roasted it in the fire, and they ate it. After a party set out on makeshift snowshoes in an attempt to cross the mountain pass, 2/3 of those remaining at Truckee Lake were children. Mrs. Graves was in charge of 8, and Lavina Murphy and Eleanor Eddy together took care of 9. Migrants called in 8 mice, but that strayed into their cabins, and many were soon weakened and spent most of their time in bed. Occasionally, one would be able to make the full-day trek to see the Donners, but news came that Jacob Donner and 3 hired men had all died. One of them, Joseph Reinhardt, confessed on his deathbed that he had murdered Wolfinger. George Donner's hand had become infected, which left 4 men to work at the Donner camp. And here's a picture of the artist's rendering of the Truckee Lake camp, based on descriptions of Graves, and it looks like tents or cabins. Kind of hard to really see. Now Margaret Reed had managed to save enough food for a Christmas pot of soup, to the delight of her children. But by January, they were facing starvation and considered eating the oxides that served as their roof. Margaret Reed, Virginia Reed, Milt Elliott, and the servant girl Eliza Williams attempted to walk out, reasoning that it would be better to try to bring food back than sit and watch the children starve to death. They were gone for 4 days in the snow before they had to turn back. Their cabin was now uninhabitable. The oxide roof served as their food supply, and the family moved in with the Breens. The servants went to live with other families. One day, the Graves came by to collect on the debt owed by the Reeds, and they took the oxides and all that the family had to eat. Now, the mountain party at Truckee Lake began to fail. Augustus Spitzer and Bayless Williams, the driver for the Reeds, died, more from malnutrition than starvation. Now, Franklin Graves fashioned 14 pairs of snowshoes out of oxbows and hide. On December 16th, a party of 17 men, women, and children set out on foot in an attempt to cross the mountain pass. As evidence of how grim their choices were, 4 of the men were fathers, 3 of them were women, and there were also mothers, and they gave their young children to other women, and they packed lightly, taking what had become 6 days rations, a rifle, a blanket each, a hatchet, and some pistols, hoping to make their way to Bear Valley. Historians Charles McClashen later called this snowshoe party the Forlorn Hope. 2 of those without snowshoes, Charles Berger and 10-year-old William Murphy, turned back early on. Other members of the party fashioned snowshoes for 12-year-old Lemuel Murphy on the first evening from one of the pack saddles that they were carrying. Now, the snowshoes proved to be awkward but effective on the arduous climb. Arduous climb. Now, the members of the party were neither well nourished nor accustomed to camping in 12 feet snow, and by the 3rd day, most were snowblind. On the 6th day, Eddie discovered his wife had hidden a half-pound of bear meat in his pack. The group set out again. In the morning of December 21st, Stanton had been straggling for several days, and he remained behind, saying he would follow shortly. His remains were found at that location the following year because he ended up dying on the trek. The group would become lost and confused. After 2 more days without food, Patrick Dolan proposed one of them should volunteer to die in order to feed the others. Some suggested a duel, while another account describes an attempt at a lottery. Eddie suggested that they keep moving until someone simply fell, but a blizzard forced the group to halt. Antonio, the animal handler, was the first to die, and Franklin Graves was the next casualty. Now, as the blizzard progressed, Dolan began to rant deliriously. He stripped off his clothes, he ran into the woods, he returned shortly afterwards, and died a few hours later. Not long after, possibly because Murphy was near death, some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. The mule's sister, Sarah, tried to feed him some, but he died shortly afterwards. Eddie, Salvador, and Lewis refused to eat because they were disgusted by this, and I would be too. The next morning, the group stripped the muscle and organs from the bodies of Antonio, Dolan, Graves, and Murphy, and they dried them to store for the days ahead, taking care to ensure that nobody would have to eat his or his relatives. And now here's a picture of William H. Eddy. After 3 days rest, they began to they set off again, searching for the trail. Eddie eventually succumbed to his hunger and ate human flesh, but that was soon gone. They began taking up parts of their snowshoes to eat the oxide webbing and discussed murdering Lewis and Salvador for food. Now, Eddie warned the 2 men, and they quietly left. Now, Jay Fosdick died during the night, leaving only 7 members of the party. Now, Eddie... where was I at? Oh, yeah. Okay, so after several more days, 25 left. So Eddie and Mary Graves left to hunt, but when they returned with deer meat, Fosdick's body had already been cut apart for food. After several more days, 25 since they had left Truckee Lake, they came across Salvador and Lewis, who had not eaten for about 9 days, and they were probably close to death because your body has to be able to eat. You can't go without eating or drinking. William Foster shot both men, thus realizing his plans from before they had left. Their bodies were butchered and their flesh dried for consumption. Now, though the murder was not kept secret, Christian Johnson notes that Foster was not greatly blamed for it, and he spent the rest of his life without being troubled by the authorities. And this can be attributed to the general attitude, as expressed by Lewis Petronovich, that the lives of Native Americans seem to matter very little to anybody. Now, not more than a few days later, the group stumbled onto a Native American settlement looking so deteriorated that the camp's inhabitants initially fled. The Native Americans gave them what they had to eat: acorns, grass, and pine nuts. After a few days, Eddie continued on with the help of tribe members to a ranch in a small farming community at the edge of the Sacramento Valley. A hurriedly assembled rescue party found the other 6 survivors on January 17th, and their journey from Truckee Lake had taken about 33 days. Now, James Reed would eventually make it out of the Sierra Nevada and into Rancho Johnson in late October. Now, he was safe and recovering at Sutter's Fort, but each day he became more concerned for the fate of his family and friends. He pleaded with Colonel John C. Fremont to gather a team of men to cross the pass and help the party. In return, Reed promised to join Fremont's forces and fight in the Mexican-American War, and he was joined by McCutcheon, who had been unable to return, but Stanton, as well as some other members of the Harlan Young group. The Harlan Young wagon train had arrived at Sutter's Fort on October 8th, the last to make it over the Sierra Nevada that season. The party of roughly 30 horses and a dozen men carried food supplies and expected to find the Donner Party on the western side of the mountain along the Bear River, below the steep approach to Immigrant Gap. Perhaps starving but alive, when they arrived in the river valley, they found only a migrant couple who had been separated from their company, and they were near starvation and dying. Now, two guides deserted Reed and McCutcheon with some other horses, but they pressed on further up the valley to Yuba Bottoms, walking the last mile on foot. Reed and McCutcheon stood looking up at Immigrant Gap, only 12 miles from the top, and it was blocked by snow. Possibly on the same day, the Marines attempted to lead one last effort to crest the pass from the east. Despondent, they turned back to Sutter's Fort. Much of the military in California were engaged in the Mexican-American War, and with them the able-bodied men. And throughout the region, roads were blocked, communications compromised, and supplies were unavailable. Only 3 men responded to a call for volunteers to rescue the Donner Party, and Reed was laid over in San Jose until February because of regional uprisings and general confusion. He spent that time speaking with other pioneers and acquaintances. The people of San Jose responded by creating a petition to the United States Navy to assist the people at Truckee Lake. 2 local newspapers reported that members of the Snowshoe Party had resorted to cannibalism, which helped to foster sympathy for those still trapped. Residents of Yerba Buena, many of them recent migrants, had raised $1,300, which was $44,900 in today's money, and organized relief efforts to build 2 camps to supply a rescue party for the refugees. A rescue party, including William Eddy, started on February 4th from the Sacramento Valley. Rain and swollen river forced several delays. Eddy stationed himself at Bear Valley, while the others made a steady progress through the snow and storms to cross the pass to Truckee Lake, caching their food at stations along the way so that they did not have to carry it all the way with them. Now, 3 of the rescue party turned back, but 7 forged on. Now, on February 18th, the seven-man rescue party scaled Fremont Pass, which is now known as Donner Pass. As they neared where Eddy told them the cabins would be, they began to shout. A haggard Mrs. Murphy appeared from a hole in the snow, stared at them and asked, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The relief party doled out food in small portions, and concerned that it might kill them if the emaciated immigrants overate. All the cabins were buried in snow. Sodden oxide roofs had overpowering. 13 people at the camps were dead, and their bodies had been loosely buried in snow near the cabin roofs. Some of the migrants seemed emotionally unstable, but 3 of the rescue party trekked to the Donners and brought back 4 gaunt children and 3 adults. Leanna Donner had particular difficulty waking up in the steep incline from Elder Creek to Truckee Lake. Later, writing, "Such pain and misery as I endured that day is beyond any description anybody can imagine." George Donner's arm was so gangrenous that he could not move it. 23 people were chosen to go with the rescue party, leaving 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake and 12 at Elder Creek because they couldn't get to all of them. Now the rescuers concealed the fate of the snowshoe party, informing the rescued migrants only that they did not return because they were frostbitten. Patty and Tommy Reed were soon too weak to cross the snowdrifts, and no one was strong enough to carry them. Margaret Reed faced the agonizing predicament of accompanying her two older children to Bear Valley and watching her two frailest be taken back to Truckee Lake. And they were taken without a parent. Without a parent, she made rescuer Aquila Glover swear on the honor as a Mason that he would not return for her children. Now, Patty told her, well, mother, if you never see me again, do the best that you can. Upon their return to the lake, the Breens refused them entry into their cabin, but after Glover left more food, the children were grudgingly admitted. Now, here are stumps. These right here are stumps of trees cut at the older creek site by members of the Donner Party. And this photograph was taken in 1866. Now, the height of the stumps indicate the depth of the snow and how much they had gotten. Now, the rescue party was dismayed to find that the first Kosh station had been broken into by animals, leaving them without food for days on end. After struggling on the walk over the pass, John Denton slipped into a coma, and he would eventually end up dying. Ada Kesselberg died soon afterwards. Her mother was inconsolable, refusing to let the child's body go. After several days more of travel through difficult country, the rescuers grew very concerned that the children would not survive. Now, some of them ate their buckskin fringe from one of the rescuers' pants and the shoelaces of another. To the late party's surprise, on their way down from the mountains, they met the next rescue party, which included James Reed. Upon hearing his voice, Margaret sank into the snow, overwhelmed. Now, after those rescued migrants made it safely into Bear Valley, William Hook, Jacob Donner's stepson, broke into food stores, and he fatally gorged himself. The others continued to Sutter's Fort, where Virginia Reed wrote, "I really thought I had stepped over into paradise." She was amused to note one of the young men asked her to marry him, although she was only 13 and recovered from starvation, but she had turned him down. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for women to get married young, with the family's permission. Now, around the time the first relief party was being organized, nearby California settler and patriarch George C. Yount, who had likely previously heard of the plight of the Donner Party, had distressing dreams of a struggling group of starving pioneers in deep snow. Yount, Mariano, Guadalupe Vallejo, and others then raised $500 to send out another rescue party, which would be Rescue Party number 2. On March 1st, the second relief party arrived at Truckee Lake. Those rescuers included veteran mountain men, notably John Turner, who accompanied the return of Reed and McCutcheon. Reed was reunited with his daughter Patty and his weakened son Tommy. An inspection of the Breen cabin found its occupants relatively well, but the Murphy cabin, according to Arthur George Stewart, passed the limits of description and almost of imagination. Now, Lavina Murphy was caring for her 8-year-old son, Simon, and 2 young children of William, Eddie, and Foster. She had deteriorated mentally and was nearly blind. The children were listless and had not been cleaned in days. Louis Kesselberg had moved in and could barely move due to injured leg. No one at Truckee Lake had died between the departure of the first and the arrival of the second relief party, but Patrick Breen documented a disturbing visit in the last week of February from Mrs. Murphy, who said her family was considering eating Mrs. Milt Elliott. Reed and McCutcheon found Elliott's mutilated body, but the Elder Creek camp fared no better. Now, the first 2 members of the relief party to reach it saw Trudeau carrying a human leg, and when they made their presence known, he threw it into a hole in the snow that contained the mostly dismembered body of Jacob Donner, and inside the tent, Elizabeth Donner refused to eat. Although her children were being nourished by their father's organs, the rescuers discovered 3 other bodies had already been consumed. In the other tent, Tamsen Donner was well, but George was very ill because the infection had reached his shoulder. The second relief evacuated 17 migrants from Truckee Lake, only 3 of whom were adults. Both the Breen and Graves families were prepared to go. Only 5 people remained at Truckee Lake. Kesterberg, Mrs. Murphy, and her son Simon, and the young Eddie and Foster children. Chamson Donner elected to stay with her alien husband after Reed informed her that a third relief party would arrive soon, and Mrs. Donner kept her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances with her. Now, the walk back to Bear Valley was very slow. At one point, Reed sent 2 men ahead to retrieve the first cache of food, expecting the third relief, a small party led by Salim E. Woodworth, to come at any moment. A violent blizzard arose after they scaled the pass. 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death, and Reed nearly died. Mary Donner's feet were badly burned because they were so frostbitten that she did not realize she was sleeping with him in the fire. And when the storm passed, the Breen and Graves families were too apathetic, and they were too exhausted to move. And having not eaten for days, the relief party had no choice but to leave without them. The site where the Breens and Graves had been left because became known as Starved Camp. Just like they have a nature center, a nature preserve out here called Starved Rock, which I still love to go see one day. Now, Margaret Breen reportedly took the initiative to try to keep the members of the camp alive after the others departed down the mountain. However, Elizabeth Graves and her son Franklin soon perished before the next rescue party could reach them, and the remaining party ate the flesh of their dead bodies to survive. Now, 3 members of the relief party stayed to help those remaining at the camps: Charles Stone at Truckee Lake and Charles Cady and Nicholas Clark at Alder Creek. Now, while Clark was hunting, Stone traveled to Adler Creek and made plans with Cady to return to California. According to Stewart, Chamson Donner arranged for them to take her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances. See if you guys can hear me all. I don't know if you guys can hear me with that low volume at first. Let's see if that's better. Now, Chamson Donner arranged for them to take her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances with them, perhaps for $500 in cash. Stone and Cady took the 3 girls to Truckee Lake, but left them at a cabin near with Kesterberg and Lavina Murphy when they started for Bear Valley. Cady recalled later that after 2 days on the trail, they passed Starved Camp, but they did not stop to help. They overtook Reed and the others within days. Several days later, at the Alder Creek camp, Clark and Trudeau agreed to leave for California together when they reached Truckee Lake and discovered the Donner girls still there, and they returned to Alder Creek to inform Chamson Donner. Now, William Foster and William Eddy, survivors of the snowshoe party, started from Bear Valley to intercept Reed, taking with them a man named John Stark. After a day, they met Reed, helping his children struggle onward on toward Bear Valley, all frostbitten and bleeding but alive. Desperate to rescue their own children, Foster and Eddy persuaded 4 men with pleading and money to go to Truckee Lake with them. Now, during their journey, they found the 11 survivors at Starved Camp, huddled around a fire that sunk into a pit. The relief party split with the relief party split with Foster, Eddy, and 2 others ahead, headed toward Truckee Lake. Two of the rescuers each took a child and headed back to Bear Valley. John Stark refused to leave the others, but he picked up 2 children and all the provisions and assisted the remaining Breens and Graves to safety. Sometimes advancing the children down the trail piecemeal, putting them down, and then going back to carry the other debilitated children. Now, Foster and Eddy finally arrived at Truckee Lake on March 14th, where they found their children dead. Kesterberg told Eddy that he had eaten the remains of Eddy's son. Eddy swore to murder Kesterberg if they had ever met up in California. George Donner and one of Jacob Donner's children were still alive at Alder Creek. Chamson Donner had just arrived at the Murphy cabin to see her daughters. She chose to return to her husband, even though she was informed that no other relief party was likely to be coming anytime soon. The third relief left with the Donner girls, young Simon Murphy, Trudeau, and Clark. Lavina Murphy was too weak to leave, and Kesterberg refused. Now, 2 more relief parties were mustered to evacuate any adults who might still be alive. Both turned back before getting to Bear Valley, and no further attempts were ever made to rescue anybody. On April 10th, almost a month after the third relief party left Truckee Lake, the Alcade near Sutter's Fort organized a salvage party to recover what they could of the Donner's belongings, and those were sold with part of the proceeds used to support the orphan Donner children. The salvage party found the Elder Creek tents empty except for the body of George Donner, who had died only days earlier. On their way back to Truckee Lake, they found Louis Kesselberg alive. According to him, Mrs. Murphy had died a week after the departure of the third relief. Some were later. Tamsen Donner had arrived at his cabin on her way over the pass, soaked and visibly upset. Kesselberg said he put a blanket around her and told her to start out in the morning, but she died during the night. The salvage party were suspicious of Kesselberg's story and found a pot full of human flesh in the cabin along with George Donner's pistols. Jewelry and $250 in gold. They threatened to lynch Kesselberg, who confessed that he had cashed $273 of the Donner's money at Tamsen's suggestion so that it could one day benefit her children. Now, news of the Donner's party fate was spread eastward by journalist Samuel Brannan, who ran into the salvage party as they came down from the pass with Kesselberg. Accounts of the ordeal first reached New York City in July of 1847. Reporting on the events across the U.S. was heavily influenced by the national enthusiasm for westward migration. In some papers, news of the tragedy was buried in small paragraphs, despite the contemporary tendency to sensationalize stories. Several newspapers, including those in California, wrote about the cannibalism in graphic, exaggerated detail. Now, in some accounts, now the members of